Hey guys, today we're going to be creating this responsive navbar using Tailwind. Now, the navbar in question is modelled off of DevEd's famous responsive navbar YouTube video, which is actually the most viewed YouTube video on his channel, and is one of the most viewed front-end tutorials actually out there on YouTube just in general. As you can see, a similar sort of design, and it's even got that it copies its Hamburger Menu Sidenav, which shows on slim devices like mobile, etc. As you could see, the same animation for both the logo and the side nav that slides in and then goes out again. And yeah, the desktop navbar is very simple as well. As you could see, I'll show you what on even small devices what it looks like. As you can see, it just takes up, by that point it just takes up the entire viewing width. As you can see, go back to normal. But anyway, the difference between this tutorial and his is that obviously this is all made using Tailwind, whilst his is made using HTML, CSS and JavaScript, and I actually also use JavaScript, as you can see, but we'll get onto that later on. But anyway, obviously all this is Tailwind in the HTML file, which is the reason why we've got all these class names. They all come from Tailwind. So this is just a good project if you want to learn how to create something that you will be using a lot in Tailwind, which obviously every website requires a navbar of some kind. So I mean, this is just essential Tailwind content that you'll be generating. So if this interests you, then keep watching. Okay, so we start this video off in a new empty project folder, and I'll launch up a terminal inside this project folder, and I'll use the terminal to initialize npm, and we'll use the Y flag so that we can skip all the configuration. So with npm initialized, I will install Tailwind with npm I for short, because it is short for install, and we will install Tailwind CSS like so, and we'll just wait for this to install. Okay, once installed, I'll launch up my source code editor of choice. I'll be using VS Code. Obviously you can use what you want. And inside we will create two folders: the public folder, which will contain all of our front-end files, and the source folder, which will contain our source style sheet that Tailwind will take in to its compiler, and then the compiler will look at what's in this file and it will output a file based on the Tailwind configuration inside this file. As for the Tailwind configuration, so I just ignore that, that was from previous attempt. We'll copy these Tailwind directives straight from Tailwind's documentation and paste it in there. And we'll also copy this font from Google Fonts. So we go to, the font itself is called Poppins. I'll post the links to this in case you want to use it. Obviously you could use whatever fonts and colours that you want. You don't have to follow this. I mean, I don't know why I would have to anyway, but obviously you don't have to follow the exact styling used in this tutorial. It's just, it gives you a rough idea. That's the purpose of this tutorial. And we'll copy the bold version as well, paste it in there like so. With this, we'll need to go to our package.json, and we'll need to create a script. We'll call it build CSS, and what it needs to do, it needs to point to our source file, and also give and say where we want the outputted file to end up at. So the I flag stands for input. So what file we'll take in. So the file that we'll take in will be the source, styles file inside the source folder. And then the O, so the output will output a file called styles.css in the public folder, like so. Okay, now we'll use this terminal actually. We'll say npm run build CSS, so we'll run the script that we literally just created. Okay, once we've run the script, we should now have this styles.css file here. I won't open it just because it's over 1 million lines of code and it kind of bogs down my computer, but as you can see it is there, and that is the file that contains Tailwind, the entire Tailwind framework. But importing the Poppins font isn't enough. We actually need to create a Tailwind configuration file so that we can add in our own class to Tailwind, which uses the Poppins font. So we will use npx tailwind css init to create the Tailwind configuration file inside our project. I don't know why this isn't working. Oh wait, we just entered it now, as you can see. Once we've run the command, we should now have this configuration file. Inside extend, we can create our own classes, and we will extend the font family, which means we can add our own font family class. So it will be called Poppins, and we will use the Poppins font, but actually it's another thing as well. We will do it like so, using double quotations. I'll show you why in a second. So basically what they want us to use is Poppins like that with quotations, but this doesn't require quotations. And if we just do single quotations, then it will, when it actually compiles this, it will compile it without quotations. So to get it to compile with the actual quotations, we'll use double quotations like so. And with this, we will run the build command again, because we've modified the configuration file. So we'll say npm run build css. Okay, now that we've ran that again, we'll create the actual index.html file, and there'll only be one HTML file, because remember, it's not a real website, it's just a navbar, and that's it. So we'll give it a title at the very least though, and then we will import our style sheet. And it's very important that we import the styles in the public folder, the one that was outputted by Tailwind, rather than the source style sheet. And inside we will just have a header. We'll say hello world, and so that's, this header will be Poppins. I will have a class and font Poppins, and again this was created by us. We use font because that's what we always use for fonts in Tailwind, but this Poppins was literally just created by us. This is not a class that comes with Tailwind. This is solely created by us. And if you're wondering how I got the code snippets, then there's actually an extension which I'd recommend that you install if you do use Tailwind. It's called this one. What's the first one that comes up? Tailwind CSS IntelliSense. Very good extension. So we'll open this as a live server, and hopefully this should be okay. I don't know why. And there's actually a typo there. Sorry, it's styles, not style. Sorry, that was a bit of a mistake on my behalf. And again, we'll launch up. As you can see, we've actually got the HTML file now, and it's saying hello world, so we know that this is working. Okay, and the first thing that we will properly do in this file is we will create the image, which is simply the backdrop for this navbar. So we'll set the height to be screen, which is the equivalent of what it says there actually, thanks to the extension that I just showed you. Height, viewing height, 100 viewing height, sorry, and yeah, same with screen. So it takes up both dimensions of the viewport, and then we set it to be absolute, and then so that it's positioned correctly, we set it so that its top left corner is aligned with the viewport, top left corner, like so. And then as for the image, I'll just copy this over. Well, I've got the URL anyway. I have to. So we'll copy over the URL like so. Obviously, again, what I mean, you know, this isn't even a real website, so it goes without saying that you can use whatever you want. Obviously, well, it's unlikely that you have a full page image anyway. We'll set the object to be cover so that the image sizes itself to fit its container, even if that means cropping off some pixels in the process. So we'll use word wrapping so that we don't get any of that. And yeah, we'll set this to be absolute positioning as well. And again, we align it, and then we say width full and height full, so that's 100% the width and height of its container. Now if we preview this, we can see that here's the image. I think it's a bit too strong for my liking. I think that the colours are a bit too vivid. So the way that I solve this is I simply, below the image, I just created another div. And it's the reason why I set the image to be absolute position, even says that.
so that I could add this overlay, which is also absolute positioning, and it'll be rendered on top of the image because it's rendered after, and that's how absolute positions work. Is that unless we use Z-index, then things that are rendered after will be rendered on top, because I think I like just stacking things on top of each other. Again, we use the same trick in terms of taking up the entire dimension of its container, and then we set it this time. We'll set it to have a background color of gray, and then we set it to have a strength of 400. And yeah, so at the moment, if we don't set the opacity on this, obviously that will just take up the whole thing. But we'll set the opacity on this so that it's actually an overlay and not just a full-on color replacement. So for 40% opacity, as you can see, now it's actually functioning as a color overlay, which is good. And what we'll do actually, we'll create a comment. Main website content, obviously this will be, pretty much everything here will be up to your discretion. It's very unlikely that you have a full screen image as your actual, that's the only thing that your website is going to display. It wouldn't be exactly a great website. And since we created that, you know what, we'll create another content, and another comment. We'll say navbar content in all caps so that we can vividly see it. And we'll create a section, just like how we created a section for the main website content, because we will separate things out using sections. And we'll set its position to be fixed. Now, fixed position means that it will remain at the top. Well, not at the top, but it will remain in its position regardless of where how scrolled we are. So if we scroll down, then it will still remain in its position, and the position that we will set it to be will be at the very top, as you can see. And we'll also set it to be full width, because it's not full. Only display block is takes up 100% the width by default. If it's fixed, then we actually need to specify it to be 100 viewing width, to take up 100% the width of the viewport. So with that, we will create the actual nav like so, and again we'll set width to be full, so 100% of its container, which is 100% of the viewport. And then we set BG green, so this will be its background color, and it will be a medium strength green color, and we'll set it to have height 16, so that gives it some height dimension, and we'll give it some padding on the X axis, so both on right and left edges have some padding of strength 3. Its text color will be white, so all the text inside of this nav will be white by default, and it will also be bold as well thanks to this. Now if we actually see this, if we preview this, where's the nav bar? I can't see anything. Well, as I mentioned before, this is position fixed, this is position absolute, and so essentially everything that isn't block positioned, it will just simply follow the principle of the ones to be rendered last will be rendered on top of the other ones. Because remember, block position, they can't be stacked on top of each other. However, absolute and relative, they can be if we have the correct styling. So the way that we fix this and overwrite the default rules is we'll set a Z-index, we'll set it to be 20 to make sure that it's on top of the image. So if we go back now, as you can see, we can actually see this. Whereas otherwise, we would have to move this to below the main website content in order to see it, but the Z-index overwrites that standard rule. Before we continue, I'll add a comment here actually, just that we can easily identify that this is an navbar, because oftentimes, especially with Tailwind, reading HTML files can actually be quite challenging, because it all looks like, there's quite a lot going on in the classes of these elements, so it can be a bit overwhelming, so comments are even more important in situations like those. Next, we'll create a div, and this div will serve as a sort of a width for our text elements or the content in our nav. You'll see more what I mean by this in a second, but we'll give it a max width of screen large, sorry, not screen small, screen large, and that corresponds to 1020 something, I don't know. But yeah, I think it's it says that actually 1024 pixels, as you can see, a max width of that. And to center this element, we will set the margin X to be auto, so both on the left and right edges we'll set that to be auto, and it will be display flex, and we'll use justify between, because remember, a flex are row flexes are rows unless we specify them to be columns, which we haven't. And justify between is the main axis, so a row's main axis is its horizontal axis. And using justify between, we are saying that the elements must be spread out along the entire width of the container. And then we'll set items to be center, like so, to center the children of the flex in the center on the y-axis, which is the alternate axis for a flex row, which is what it is. And this won't have any actual change at the moment because obviously we don't have any text elements inside of here, so we'll change it now. We'll create a paragraph and we'll say the nav, so obviously it's just some dummy text, not even a real website. Increase the font size like so. We use uppercase to change each character into uppercase, or to make each character uppercase, sorry, and then we'll set tracking to be widest, and this will simply increase the gap between each character. And so now if we see what this looks like, as you can see the nav here, because of the nav, and it's not spread out across the full width because of the max width, but if we decrease the width, it will actually stop. It will actually take up the full width of the nav bar if we get to a certain viewport width, and that's due to the fact that its width is full, but then we also set a max width so that it can't exceed the width specified in the max width, but on viewports that are lower than the max width, it will take up 100% of the viewport. I hope that makes sense. Next, we will create a div, and this will contain all of the elements to the right of the nav icon. So the elements inside this div will be quite spaced together, and because it's a container div, we will mark it with a comment. Inside we'll create some A tags because they're meant to be links, but obviously, again, it's a dummy website, so we'll use a hashtag to make them dummy links. And in VS Code, you can, if you hold down Shift and Alt and then press the down key, simultaneously you can copy the lines like so. And we'll set the text now, we'll say home, about, work, projects, again just dummy text. And as for the classes, I'm going to hold down Alt to write out text on multi-lines. Because remember they're spaced in a row, in a flex row, we'll give them some margin, space them out from each other on the horizontal axis. And if we can look at what this looks like, as you can see, they are spaced out now, and it's, you know, they're bold as well due to the fact that we, all the way up here we said font bold. What we want to do now is you want to give a transition, just so that you can see how Tailwind transitions work. So the way that we need this transition base class in order to have any kind of transition, and then we'll set duration to be 500. So the transition will last for 0.5 seconds or 500 milliseconds. And then as for the transition, when we hover over any of the links, we'll set the text we'll change it to this color here, a grey color with a strength of 200. So now if we see what this looks like, as you can see, it's changing slightly. I know it's only a very subtle change because there's not much difference from white and the grey color that we chose, but hopefully you should be able to see that things are actually changing, transitioning. And because it's actually a lot of copied and pasted code, we'll actually cut that, and we'll go to our source style sheet, and we'll create a new item, a new class called nav items, and we'll use the apply Tailwind directive, paste in the classes there, and then inside our terminal we'll rerun the build command that we created at the start. Because remember, every time you make changes to Tailwind's configuration, in order to get those changes represented in the final CSS file that it outputs, we need to rerun the build command. So with that, we can simply use single nav items class as a replacement for all of this stuff, which is quite cumbersome. Again, we can press Control D to highlight, to select multiple things the same value, like so. So we paste that in there, and as you can see, it's acting exactly as it was before because of that class that we just created. Another thing that we'll do, we'll actually go to this nav items class and we'll give it a minus margin of 3, and this will just counteract the edges so that things are actually spaced out more evenly. And we'll also set the MD on view screens that are medium, width and higher. We'll set it to be block. Now it won't make a difference at the moment because it was already blocked by default, but we'll set it to be hidden, so that now it will be hidden unless we're on viewport width medium, size or larger, which we are currently on. But if we aren't, then it will go to the hidden, and as you can see, it just disappears now. And to replace its absence, obviously we'll create the navbar, sorry, the hamburger menu here. But we're just getting our main menus to disappear for now. As you can see, it's actually disappeared. So as for this hamburger menu, we'll get on to creating it right now. So again, it will be a div, and we'll write a comment saying that it'll be a div. We'll say hamburger, like so, and this will just be the container class. Whoops, actually that shouldn't be there, that should be next to the opening tag. It looks a lot nicer there. So I'll set it to have both the same width and the same height, both of a value of 8, and we'll set it to be flex, and this time it will be flex column instead of the flex row, which is what flex containers are by default. And so when we say justify between, this time it will relate to the y-axis. So we'll space the items out along the y-axis rather than the x-axis. And we'll also say cursor to be pointer, so that our cursor changes to the pointer icon when we hover over it with our mouse. And we'll also give it an ID as well, so that we can target it easily when we get to doing the JavaScript file. Oh yeah, and one more thing as well, we will also need to say MD to be hidden, so that it won't show on a medium-sized viewport and above, because remember, that's when we're showing the main nav items, not the hamburger menu. Now at the moment this is just an empty container, so we'll create some divs inside, and they'll all have their own IDs, so that we can target them individually in the JavaScript file, and you'll see more about this later on. The reason why we need to target them individually in the JavaScript file is because we'll be applying a transition, an elaborate transition, which I showed at the start, where the hamburger menu transforms into an X. And what we'll do, just to save time, I actually just go to the source style sheet, and I'll create the class for it straight away, rather than creating it inline and then just copying it over, because that's what we're eventually going to do anyway, so you might as well just do it here. So they'll have full widths, take up 100% the width of their container. They will have a very measly height to them, just of a value of 1. A white background color. They'll be rounded, and the full value means that they are more like a pill than more like rounded edges. It's got incredibly rounded edges, the rounded full clusters. And we'll give it a transition. The transition duration will be 500, and then we will ease in and ease out, so that will have an ease on both the opening and closing of the transition. And again, I know it's quite tedious, but it's what you have to do. npm run build css. Okay, and now it's finished running, and now we'll just apply these styles. So, well, this class that we created, whoops, hamburger slice, like so. Okay, now if we see we need to obviously decrease the width so you can actually see it. Okay, this is looking good now. Obviously, when we click on it, nothing happens. As you can see, the main hamburger is actually there. Okay, now would be a good time to create the JavaScript file so that we can start doing the animation. This is just before we move on to doing anything else, such as, doing the side nav. And inside here, we'll create a very important util function, well, we say util functions, but in actuality we're only going to have one of these in this entire JavaScript file and this entire project for that matter, and that's this one here, add and remove classes. So the first argument will be the classes to add to the elements, the second argument the classes to remove from the elements, and the third argument will be the elements that we actually want to apply both the add and remove classes to. So the first thing that we're going to do here is we are going to perform some error checking to see if the parameters of this function are formatted correctly. So they need to either be arrays or individual strings to represent a single class. If there's something like Boolean or something, then it's not going to work. So what we're going to do is we are going to call this method here on the arguments. And normally the arguments is an array that represents, so I have both the add, remove and elements as individual items in this array called arguments, which is just all functions have access to by default in JavaScript. However, it's not an actual array, even though it looks like one. So what we're doing is we are calling the slice method from the array object, which inherits all of its methods from prototype, and we are saying core, which is the equivalent of, say if we just had an array like this, and then we just said slice, that would be what it's equivalent of. However, arguments instead of this, but we can't do that by default because arguments isn't actually a real array, so it doesn't have this access to the slice method like every other array does. And the reason why we're calling the slice method is because it returns a new array. That new array is a real array, and it will contain all of the arguments as individual items, and it will be assigned this arguments array. So I hope that makes sense. Again, we can't just call slice on its own because basically the array data gets the slice method from the prototype. So to access this method, we are just getting access to the prototype class where everything comes from, where the arrays inherit all their methods from. So that's the only reason for that, and then after that, again, it's self-explanatory, these two methods. I hope that makes sense. Again, I'll post a link in the description to where you can read up more about this, like how this works in the description, just in case you didn't get my kind of brief description. So after this, we will create a loop, and we will loop through the arguments array. Sorry, we won't loop through it, but we'll have as many iterations as there are items in that array. And we'll extract the item that we should currently be looping through from the arguments array. And if it doesn't exist, because we set it to be null, because we're not, say for example, we're not adding a class, then we'll just set this add parameter to be null. Then we'll continue, so we'll say skip to the next item along, essentially. Don't continue with anything that's below this continue keyword in the loop. But obviously if that continue keyword isn't met, which is the if condition not being met, then we'll say array is array, and then we'll pass in arg like so. And unlike the slice method, this is array method does actually come from the array class in JavaScript by default, unlike the slice method, which comes from the prototype class that or array data types inherit from, and it just simply returns a boolean based on whether the variable passed into it is actually an array or not. So if that's false, because it's not an array and it's also not a string, so we say type of arg not equal to be string, so it's neither an array or string. And actually one more as well, we'll say if it's not instance of element, so if it's neither an array nor string nor an actual HTML DOM element, then we'll throw an error, throw like that. We'll say element is not an array slash string slash HTML element. And also one final thing, if it is true that because obviously we'll only get to this if obviously if an error hasn't been thrown, because if an error is thrown, then everything in our script stops. But if it is true that it's not an array, but obviously it's either a string or an element, Then what we'll need to do is we will assign the matching item from the actual array to be, so essentially just insert it into an array. And the only reason why we're doing this is just to allow more flexibility, because ultimately you'll be looping through it either way, even if it is just a string. So that means if we just loop through like an array of one item, obviously the loop will only last for one iteration. We only do it like this because we just want more flexibility, so that, you know, they don't have to put an array just with one item when they actually assign values to this parameter when they call the method. It's just like neater that way, and is easier to use the function. But anyway, once that loop has been done, which is sort of like an error checking loop, we will use array destructuring. Elements are on the arguments are, so we create these three variables. So this will be assigned to the first item in this array, second item, third item, like so. So we'll now loop through the elements array, which we know to be an array even if we've only passed in one element into this elements parameter, because of what we did here where we just sandwiched that single thing into an array. And again, we loop through it using the for each loop, which all arrays have access to. And another thing that we need to do, we actually need to do another, because remember, this was only for like one element. What happens if one of the items in the array is not an actual element? If that is the case, then we'll need to throw an error. If any one of the items in the array element is not a DOM element, then what we're doing below wouldn't work, so we'll need to throw an error. And sorry, that's actually wrong, it needs to be instanced off like so. And if this add r is assigned a value, because it won't be assigned a value if add was just skipped, but by us assigning a value of null to it. So if we didn't use null for it, then it should actually be an array, which means that we'll be able to loop through it. And whoops, for each of them we'll simply assign, we'll simply add its class to the element that we're currently looping through, like so. And again, we'll do a similar thing for the remove r array. Well, if it is actually assigned a value, then it should be assigned a it should be an array due to what we've done previously. And which means that we'll be able to do the following, like so. So, you know, we do the appropriate method, so we add the classes for the add r and then remove the classes for the remove r. Very simple. Okay, now that we've actually created this utility function, again, I know it was quite complicated, but it was probably the hardest part of the actual tutorial, so well done if you managed to get through it, because the hard part's now over. Whoops, so get element by ID is what I was meant to be typing. So we'll get access to the hamburger element, because remember we gave it an ID of hamburger, well that's the reason why. And after that we'll also get access to the individual hamburger rows, or just copy it from here, just to save time. I'm sure that you understand how it works. What we'll now do is we'll create a boolean, but not before I do this comment. So we just say let hamburger open, and we'll set it to be false, because remember on initial document load the hamburger menu, well the side nav won't be open. I know we haven't created it yet, but anyway, it won't be open either way, even if it was created on initial document load, which is the reason why it's set to false. So when we do click on the hamburger, we'll call this method. Inside we will simply set the boolean to be opposite of its current value, like so. There you go. And we'll also call the method
well, we're not calling it at the moment because we haven't even created it, but that's why we're creating it now. And we'll say if the hamburger is open, then we'll call that the utility method that we literally just created. And what we'll do, hold on a sec. Yeah, so we won't remove any classes, and the actual the classes will be added to the HS1 element that we have there, and we'll apply 2 classes to this. We'll apply all of these classes will be Tailwind classes, but we'll rotate it, and we're able to do this because yeah, so these hamburger slices, they have the transition class applied to them, which means that we can have transformations applied to them, like rotation, and also this one as well, translate, which simply means move it down by a strength of 3. And now we will copy this for the other 2, so we're HS2. HS2 won't be translated or actually transformed in any way at all. Actually, the only thing that happened to the middle row is that it will just simply fade out. This one will be rotated the same amount, just in the other direction, and it will be moved up, so we have a minus, and it will be moved up a bit more, and this is just to balance things out a bit. Again, it's what I found is the best values beforehand, so I don't waste your time. And then we say return here, so that anything written here won't actually be reached if that if condition was met, and then it just returned out of the function. So if the other case is met, and that's if the hamburger open boolean was not true, it was false instead, then we will remove these classes. So all we do is just switch around the add and remove. You're pretty simple. And then of course we'll need to call this method, and we do it here. Yeah, we'll just call it like that. There you go. And then obviously we'll need to go to our index HTML file, and we'll call it like so we don't get confused with what it is. And then we import it like so that it's actually applied to the HTML file. And now if you go back, okay, so we actually have an error here. Sorry, all these were wrong actually. Oh, you know what? It makes more sense if we just change it here. So yeah, these are capital, which is the reason I should have noticed that, to be honest, but oh well, not much of a problem. Okay, so we actually have another issue, and that's the fact that we actually, in order for the, so I'll just show you in a second. So what we have at the moment is that only this middle one animates, and that's the reason for that is because it can't actually animate the transform, like the rotate and translate, without this property here. Not actually inside the hamburger slice class, but actually on as an inline style. And so now it can animate everything, including the translate and rotate. As you can see, it transitions between, and we get this cool animation. So yeah, finally, I'm sorry for the errors, guys, but yeah, we have finally gotten this to work, so it's working like so. Okay, so what we'll now do is we'll do the final markup thing that we have to do, and that is we have to create the side nav that appears on mobile, along with the hamburger menu. We should also get a side nav that appears when we click on the hamburger menu, but obviously it's not shown immediately, only the hamburger menu is. As for the actual mobile side nav container, we'll have a z index of 10, so that it's above the main website content but below the main nav. And again, like the main nav, it will be fixed so that we'll be able to view it no matter where we're scrolled on the actual page. It just happens that in this website, you know, the image takes up 100% of the viewport, so there is no ability to scroll vertically, and obviously, you know, that might not always be the case. And again, you know, it takes up 100% the height, not the width though, because it won't be. And again, like with hamburger menu, you won't be able to view it on devices that are, or just viewports that are medium width and above. And then, well, that's the section container, but this will actually be
the actual side nav as indicated by the ID that we have given it. And it will take up 100% of the width, but again we're using the same max width trick, so that actually it won't. It would only take up 100% of the width on viewports that are smaller than its max width, and at the moment we're using an extra small max width. You'll see why. It's just the one that looks good for this purpose. And its height will be full, 100% the height of its container, and so that we can animate it or give it a transition or give it the transition class, which doesn't do anything in and of itself, you know, without an actual transition. But the transitions that are applied will last for 0.5 of a second, and it will ease in both directions. And again, obviously, you know, the class that we missed out before is transform. We'll add it there now, so that we can so that we can transform it, you know, like rotate it, etc. Overflow Y will be set to auto, so that on viewports with a small height, we'll be able to scroll through it to see all of its different options, instead of having the options just, you know, really cramped up together to the point of, you know, where they actually overlap with each other. We'll just have this scrolling instead. And again, there are a lot of classes on here, I must warn you, but yeah, I'll be a flex, and the flex will be going in a column direction, and it'll be justified between. Again, it's already been explained. A lot of this has already been explained. Again, text white, pretty self-explanatory. Padding top will be 16, so that the text won't be buried underneath the main nav bar. It'll be pushed down enough so that it will actually be below the main nav bar, and not having the main nav bar cover it, so that we won't be able to see it. And so now we can view this, and as you can see, you know, here we have, whoops, obviously it won't appear then, but here it is here. And then if we want to do, as you can see, we can see that max width in action, you know, the width screen, well, it's screen now, but now it's just working off the max width. As you can see, that's how that works. And as for the actual content, again, you know, we'll copy it from here, actually, but we'll change a couple of things. The text will be the same, the actual class, we'll create that now, just so that we could save time, because this video is already quite long, I appreciate that. So we'll create it here, and then so we'll give it some margin on the top and bottom with, you know, the y-axis margin, and it'll ease in and out in both directions. When we hover over, again we'll give it, whoops, when we hover over them, we'll give it the classic, what we gave the main nav items, and we changed it to that grey colour. And we'll actually do this transition old school CSS. And the reason for that is because we want different different transitions times for the different styles that we'll be transitioning. So both transform and opacity will be 0.3 of a second, but the color will be 0.5 of a second. And again, one more time, I promise that this is last time, but we'll compile that again. Okay, and it's just given me an update message, but I'm not going to worry with that at the moment. Now I'll actually apply this class instead of the other one, the one that I had before. And what we'll do is we'll say transform as well, because remember it needs to be inline in order for it to work. We'll set opacity to be, actually no, we won't do that at the moment because we want to actually see it. We'll only do that later on. As you can see, is a text, but now, as you already guessed what I was going to do, and what I almost did, was set opacity to be 0, because remember these need to animate in, the individual text items, they need to animate in. And we'll also set them to be translate X to be 5, because they'll also move about, about a bit as well. And as for this, we will set translate X to be full, so full is 100%. So not minus, but actually, you know, translate X. So move it to the right by itself. So yeah, it will just be off the screen now because it's completely moved towards the right based on its width. So however large it was, it will move towards the right by that amount, which means that in our case, it just won't be visible in the viewports anymore. And due to the fact that
Tailwind seems to automatically apply the overflow hidden style to the body. We don't get a scroll, it's just completely not visible. So in our JavaScript file, we'll get access to a couple of things. First thing will be the mobile side nav, so we'll get access to it like so. Next, we'll get access to an array of things actually, and that will be the individual Sidenav items. Because remember, we want them to all animate in. Currently, they're set to opacity. Currently, they're set to opacity 0. But we need to get access to them all so that we can animate them in staggered. And actually, it's not get element; it's query selector all. And remember, we need to include the dot here as well to specify that we are targeting them based off of their class. And so the first thing that we will do is we will say, we'll create a comment here so that we could separate things out of it. We'll say add and remove, again with that utility function that we created. We're not going to add any classes, but here we are going to remove that translate x full class. Remember the one that made it so far towards the right that we can't even view it. So now if we just try this out real quick, obviously it won't work for going back in, but as you can see, it does animate actually in because we just removed that class and it transitions on that. Next we'll loop through the Sidenav items because we want to animate them all. So we do that with the for each loop because it's quite easy. Again, you don't need semicolons, but I use them. And then what we will do is, to stagger it, we will need to do a couple of things. We use a set timeout function, which allows for a delay. And as for the delay, what will the delay be? Well, we will create a local scope variable, so it gets reinstantiated every time this function is called again, and it will be called on every time we click on the hamburger menu. So 0.3 of a second, because 300 milliseconds. That's what it will start off as, so we'll put it there. And again, we'll use the add and remove classes. We'll just copy this just for brevity. And again, it will be applied to the actual element that's currently being looped through. And the two things, again, I'll just copy this again because I know that it's getting long now, but we will use an array this time because we're actually removing, but that's not an array. Again, well, that's an array. So we're actually removing two classes this time, both the opacity 0 because we want it to fade into view now, and both this translate because we want the text to take up its normal space. And as for how we will get the staggered animation, and as for how we will get the staggered effect, we will say current delay. Remember, this is inside of the, actually no, this isn't, it needs to be. Yes, inside of the for each loop, we will say current delay plus equals 200, so that will just accumulate. And one more thing actually as well that we'll need to do, we'll need to declare an array. So we'll declare it here, and we'll need to write a comment so we know what it's used for. So timeout store like so. And the reason why we're using this array is because just in case we close the hamburger menu before it's finished animating in, before all this text is finished animating in, then we'll need to keep track of each timeout variable so that we can clear it, so that weird things don't happen basically. If we do decide to close the side nav back in before it's actually finished animating out. So we need to keep access to them so that we can clear them if we are closing the side nav. And by clearing, I mean we will no longer wait for them. So if we are currently waiting for a set timeout function to activate its code, then we'll just clear it and it won't work anymore. And again, I noticed another error as well that I made. I don't know how I made the error, but it needs to be here, actually in the set timeout, not there, sorry. And so yeah, so if we are actually removing the side nav, and we don't want it to show it, again we'll use the same principle, we'll remove this instead of actually, you know, applying it. Sorry, no, we are applying it because we want it to become invisible again, or to go out again. And then we'll reset
mobile Sidenav. It says timeout store. If it does have items, due to the fact that we pushed the set timeout methods to it, then we'll loop through each set timeout method, and we'll use the clear timeout method, which is on the window object, which is the reason why we could just write it out like this, and we'll just pass in the set timeout, and that will clear all the awaiting set timeouts that haven't already been activated, if there are any. And then after that, we will just set it back to be in an empty array because we have cleared all of them. So therefore, if we cleared all of them, then we don't need to store them anymore. Okay, and after this, we do now actually need to do something else as well. We need to apply the opacity 0 and translate x5 to the individual Sidenav text elements if our hamburger menu is animated back in. And we only do this obviously if a hamburger open is closed, so if it's gone back in. If the transition has ended due to the fact that it's opened up, then we'll simply return. So if we have just closed it, the closing transition is just finished, then we'll loop through the Sidenav items again, and then we'll simply add these classes. Again, we're not going to using that method. We're just going to add like so. And then, actually we'll test this out, but there is one more thing that we need to do. I know it's quite tedious, but yeah, as you can see, this is what we got. As you can see, it's looking good, and it even works if, it doesn't mess about, essentially. As you can see, this is how it works, this is looking good. So if we do decide, again, it doesn't mess about, in terms of how it doesn't fail if we, it doesn't fail if we do decide to go back on it, and like we cancel it in mid transition, it doesn't just cause an error or anything like that. One final thing that we will do is we will add an event listener on the window, which is the reason why we don't specifically state that the element that we apply it to, because it automatically applies it to the window if we don't specify anything. So like element dot, if we just write it like this, then it automatically gets applied to the window. And what we'll do in this variable, we'll get access to the current width of the body, like so. And if the width is greater than 768, because that's the median breakpoint, the middle breakpoint, the one where we want the hamburger menu to disappear and the normal menu to appear, then we will set the hamburger open to be false because we want it to go back in now. Again, mobile Sidenav, we'll call that method as well because that will actually make it go back in. And finally, we'll copy this so that it's ready for another animation if we do decide to open it up again. Okay, that's done. So if we open it out like this, I think we go back in. As you can see, it's disappeared, it's gone back in. What we want. And yeah, that's it. That's it for this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned how to use Tailwind. I hope you really got stuck in and actually properly learnt Tailwind, or at least learnt a lot of the core features of Tailwind rather than spending hours reading documentation or whatever and only learning just stuff which is relevant to Tailwind, but it might not actually be relevant to everyday front-end development. So I hope you benefited in that way. If you did, then I would really appreciate it if you considered liking and subscribing, and also if you posted down in the description box below like any queries that you had or any questions that you might ask me. I would enjoy reading those and I'll answer them to the best of my ability. But anyway, I've talked far too long already in this video, so peace out and have a great day.